as a host to live stream the meeting onto YouTube, where you will get sent and the recording afterwards. So it will be emailed to you and also posted in the event discussion channel in the Design Buddies Discord community, which y'all can join. All right, welcome everyone. We are live. Welcome to Working Together as Designers and Product Managers with Christine, Kevin, and Jay from LinkedIn. All of you probably are familiar with LinkedIn. I love LinkedIn. Not sponsored, but I love LinkedIn as a product. I use it a lot. It's actually one of my favorite social media platforms, to be honest. I met a lot of all of you in the chat here through LinkedIn as well. And so guys, I wonder who I am. I'm Grace. I am full-time. I'm a designer at Electronic Arts, product designer, but I also founded Design Buddies about a year ago today. And since then, we've grown to almost 20,000 buddies, and Design Buddies is an inclusive global design community where we can share resources, hang out, just chill, and be wholesome with each other. We have a lot of great events, resources, mentorship like this one. We're also partnered with ADP List, Discord, Adobe, Skillshare, and more as well. And we're so excited to have Christine, Kevin, and Jay here from LinkedIn on with us today. And really quick in the chat, we also, just for a brief housekeeping, we're going to start with the presentation, and we'll have about 5 minutes of presentation, and then ending with a Q&A in the chat. So you'll use the chat to ask questions, and you'll be able to engage in the chat as well. And then Jess will be sharing a networking sheet where you can connect, you can share your LinkedIns with each other to connect with each other on social media too. And you'll be taking a group photo afterwards about at 5:59 Pacific time. And then later will be a group photo for Instagram Wave. So kind of like all of our other events too. So yeah, make sure to stay towards the end if you want to be in a group photo. With that, I'll pass the floor on to Christine, Kevin, and Jay. Welcome.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for that lovely introduction, Grace. We are so excited to be talking to all of you today at Design Buddies. So the topic of our conversation today is just sharing our personal experiences of what it's like working together as designers and PMs. To start off with a quick introduction of myself. So my name is Christine Yoon, and I'm a design manager at LinkedIn. I've been at the company for about 4 years now, started off as a designer and then basically worked my way up to a manager. But before that, my background is actually in business. A little fun fact, I almost became a product manager myself before deciding on design. I worked in consulting for about 5 years, and I developed quite a few skills that were both good for PM and then also design, but I ultimately picked design and decided to go back to graduate school and get my master's at California College of the Arts, and then pivoted into LinkedIn, which is where I am today. So that's a little bit more about myself. I'll pass it off to Kevin to introduce him.
Hey all, I'm Kevin. I'm a product designer at LinkedIn. I've been at LinkedIn in New York. I've been LinkedIn for about 3 years now. And before that, I've worked at various amount of startups and Google before that, before landing at LinkedIn. And I work on the live video and creators team here. Now pass it off to Jay.
Thanks, Kevin. Hi, my name is Jay O. I'm a product manager at LinkedIn. I've been here for about 3 years. I won't get into my full professional history since you guys can go to LinkedIn for that. I lead the audiences and measurement team, so we help customers, marketers reach the people that they need to, and then measure the success of their campaign and marketing efforts. Prior to LinkedIn, in a whole different lifetime ago, I was actually in clinical research. So random little fun fact is one of my teams I did the clinical research with was actually the team that led the Pfizer phase 3 trial. So that's really, really cool to find out that my team was part of that effort. Really neat. Other fun fact is an entirely different lifetime that's not on my LinkedIn profile is I went to culinary school, dropped out predominantly because, well, if you guys have Asian parents that ask you how are you going to make money and you go to culinary school, you don't have a good answer. So we can talk about that, but you hear more about that during the presentation as well. Super excited to be here.
Awesome. I think I learned something new about you, Jay. So thanks for sharing that. Well, cool. So for the agenda for today, this is basically what we're going to cover. So Jay's going to give an overview in terms of what his day-to-day is like as a product manager. And then we'll start talking a little bit more about the intersectionality between the responsibilities of product and design, and then end with some tips around how to work more effectively with PMs. And then for those that are PMs here, we'll leave you with some tips as well in terms of how you can effectively collaborate more with designers, and we'll open it for Q&A. So with that, I'm going to hand it off to Jay to cover the next section.
So simple question, if you are a PM, then you're completely biased in answering this, but for everybody else, if you want to give it a stab on chat, what do you think a PM actually does? Now I'll give you about 30 seconds for that. Go to meetings, this is absolutely true, all day long. Okay, what else? Awesome, solves problems, makes decisions, manages budgets. Awesome. Wow, you guys type really fast, and I'm reading through it. And you know what? You're absolutely right. Everyone is absolutely correct, especially that one that mentioned like glue or being connected tissue or being a hub. Number one, I'm really glad no one said pushes people around or tells me what to do, because that is definitely not what a product manager should be. And if you work with them, or if you are a product manager, hope you're not doing that. A lot of PMs on this call too, so I really appreciate that. But really, standard definition looks something like this. It's someone that owns the product strategy, defines requirements, and bring those features or products to market. So when we think about product and how it sits at the intersection of multiple disciplines, it might fit into something like this. You understand what the customer or the user needs. You understand what technologies are available and required to meet those needs. You understand the needs or goals of the business, how it fits into the industry landscape. So with this holistic understanding, it's expected that the product leader or the product manager is able to partner well with design, engineering, marketing, other cross-functional teams to take features conception to market. And everything that applies from like digital products to the Apple iPhone falls into this category, right? So how do you take that idea and what the market needs and interpret that into some value that actually can be materialized for your users? Another way to look at that is, and this is where the whole, burned out career of my culinary career that never happened comes to bear, is if you heard the term run the pass. If you've watched Hell's Kitchen, you've probably heard of that. If you worked in a restaurant, attended culinary school, you might be familiar with the term running the pass. So it's that role that's occupied by anyone from the head chef to the restaurant manager, sous chef, someone that stands between the front of the house, the tables and the customers, and the back of the house, which is your kitchen, your line station chefs, et cetera, to create clarity around priorities, to check quality, to pivot the teams as necessary as the situation changes. In the day-to-day, that's a lot of what the PM does, right? I know a term that also gets thrown out is mini CEO or janitor, and all of those things are inclusive, because they're essentially, as product owners, your success is measured by the ability that you have to drive impact. You're only as effective as how well you're able to inspire that team to build that great product. So you might agree or disagree with me on the extent of how that definition fits into your life right now as a PM, or maybe some of the PMs you work with. But really, PMs exist in all types of roles. It doesn't look the same everywhere. And to be honest, it's because the discipline hasn't really existed in its mature state for very long, maybe a decade, max, maybe two. So the titles vary according to the needs of the role of the business. Some are more technical, or the stage of the company, where the product manager maybe is more the CEO trying to materialize that MVP of the product. You might be a project manager, just making sure things ship, or you might be the program manager that cohesively talks about the go-to-market. But really, it's because it's a discipline that continues to mature, not just in terms of the overall landscape, but how the industries that we serve in or work in respond to that value drive that we provide as product managers. It's obtaining this kind of like clarity that only happens to mature in the last few years. But let's focus on what product managers really do or should do. So before we go into this, while this is the background, there's four main competencies, right? Strategy, as we discussed, in defining what the vision is for the product or the platform, and the principles and the success metrics we're optimizing for as we build multiple features under that strategy together. Another one is operational excellence, how we do the work, from overseeing how we manage resources, create artifacts, align teams, define the product specs, how do we go to market. There's a cross-functional comms or communications and management piece. You have to be able to communicate well. You have to be able to tell the story well. How does a PM act as an accelerant and as a facilitator or a nexus to bring clarity and focus to that project and sell the vision to other teams that you invariably are dependent on, especially if you work on a platform? The last piece is around execution. The day-to-day work that we all know and we recognize as we work with a PM or act as a PM. So as it fits into the software development lifecycle, we can see how this double diamond design process, something you're probably quite familiar with as a designer, the PM fits in across this entire roadmap or entire journey. So for better or for worse, we're in it together. So if you click through, where do we overlap? Entire way. You can't work without us. Sorry, we're not leaving the picture anytime soon. But it is a journey we take together. And it makes more sense when you start translating each piece. So we look at discover for a sec. In exploring and defining the user or business problem, we have three things that need to happen, right? And while these things continue to be worked on through the development phase and even after launch in an iterative fashion, doing this well sets up the team for success. So we focus on understanding the problem, potential solutions in market, defining priorities and principles as to align why we plan to build it and how it fits in. So as we do that, the roadmap format for development allows everyone on the team to know what part they play and sells a vision so that everyone's able to stretch their creative muscle to contribute. It's a framework. It isn't a list of requirements and tasks. Let's move on to design. So design is actually my favorite phase. And it's not because most of you guys are designers, but it allows me to closely partner with product designers and engineering leads to iterate how we might build it. It's that translation step from that discovery mode. So it allows us to function as more of a supportive role and for design to help flesh out feasibility by sharing that knowledge of industry standards, competitive intel, how we might create market differentiation to add as inputs into how you designers come up with a solution that we actually test. Let's move to development. So I think where development is really, really undervalued insofar as what product and design teams can actually provide input to is during this phase, right? So a lot of people go in a waterfall-based approach where engineers just start building. They said, leave me alone in the room. Let me just build it. Don't change things up on me. But the truth is, often things don't go quite as planned. So communication needs to be really high, even if you had awesome plans that you as a superstar PM might have set, or as a design partner that you've already fleshed out. But since product design and engineering and other teams are deeply involved in the earlier stages, you have an ability to create this QA buffer layer where you can support your engineering team as they're building. So how can we do this before we get to the point where we're actually shipping? And ultimately, during this, we also end up at the place where PM works with marketing and sales during development to align the go-to-market plan. So we can support how we release this. Do we need a beta? Do we need an alpha? Do we want to test with a short whitelist? It's things that we consider during this phase in order to unlock value sooner rather than taking this pure waterfall-based approach. And then lastly, deploy. So we ship the product. Now what? Most PMs have a tendency to say, we shipped it, we walk away, let's just measure impact, get me promoted, right? But the truth is, it's overlooked by only the bad or busy PMs, teams, designers, because people typically should care about how a product lands, right? It should set you up to truly understand if you built the right thing, are you seeing the engagement that you wanted to see? Does it make sense for you to continue down this path that you've set as part of the roadmap definition? I'm sure many of you had experiences with products where you ask yourself, this would have been so good if they just did this one thing, or how did they miss this when they were building it? And really, this is the phase at which you actually have to test the metal of this. So growing adoption is just as important as getting your feature relaunched the first time. It's critical for any startup looking to survive. So if you work for a startup, this is the part that you should pay a lot of attention to. It's not the end, it's the beginning of the next phase. So if I can leave you with one key takeaway, is that the PM themselves is not an army. PMs are only as good as their team. So they go through all the actions that each phase we reviewed earlier. The most important job of the PM is their ability to foster partnership around shared principles. Everything else is icing on the cake and things you can figure out on a daily basis. So with that, I'll turn it over.
Great, thanks, Jay. So with that, I'm going to cover more in terms of responsibilities of PMs and designers. So I think as you guys saw through the presentation that Jay just gave, there is quite a lot of overlap. In design school, we learn a lot about the double diamond, but it really fits over the entire software development lifecycle, which we see. And designers actually need to be across the whole thing with PM as part of it. And because of that, that ends up being when you're working in the real world, product is probably your most consequential partner when it comes to partnering up with design. So I think with the roles of design and product, everyone kind of has their own focus, right? In school, or kind of what we learn is that designers should be really user-centric and thinking about the needs from the experience to improve how users interact with the systems. And product managers are sometimes taught that, you know, the business is what comes first. It's how much money we make, how many metrics we're impacting, and what's the return on the investment and whatnot. But in reality, it's a little bit of overlap to both, right? For if you're working in the real world as a designer, you can't just focus on the user without thinking about the business needs. And the same for a product manager, can't just focus on the business without thinking about how that impacts the customers that are using it. And even closer to reality is that there's another level that we're not even covering in this presentation altogether, is how engineering thinks about it. But all three of these partners are usually the trifecta in terms of what companies are thinking about with making decisions when it comes to product. So it's actually really important for us to all think about these things collectively to balance it out in terms of making our processes better. So ultimately, we're all in charge of creating a quality product. It's not just design, it's not just business and product. And then here's a framework in terms of for folks who might be interested in what actually means a quality product. So this is something that we use at LinkedIn whenever we're evaluating a new feature that we're trying to develop, or like, you know, a project that we're kickstarting, to make sure that it kind of fits under all three of these buckets, which is under the business, technology, and user needs that we were talking about. So I'll take a really quick pause here and just ask the audience, can you guys think of an example of what is not a product that is quality, and maybe why? So let's just see what you guys come up with here for the next 30 seconds. And to help, I'll kind of flip back to the previous slide. So these are the tenets of what we consider a quality product. So usually it might be missing one of those things, or all three. I love that one. A water bottle with several different openings. Yes, Craigslist is another one that's kind of interesting. I think, yeah, from a design perspective, it's not well executed, but it actually does pretty well in terms of like the delivering value to folks on the business front. I like some of these, like HelloFresh. There's some inconsistencies with how it's delivered. Vaccine distribution, a good one. Yeah, user value, strong business goals, but maybe not really well in terms of executed in terms of how the government has been handling like distribution. Yeah, so some really great ones, examples here. One of my personal favorite stories is Google Glass. So that one was well executed in terms of like the engineering. It was very breakthrough at the time. And from a business standpoint, like it made a lot of sense for Google to develop it because they were, you know, really breaking that field in terms of the technology. You can collect a lot of data on folks, you know, really expand how the internet is being used. But where it really lacked was the user value. It was like really creepy when people were walking around with a computer on their face and knew that they were being recorded. It just like created this adverse effect for a lot of folks. So it never really took off in terms of a quality product. So, all right. Yeah. So kind of continuing on the discussion about a quality product. So where does design and product fit in? Obviously over both of these. It's really important. But because of like, you know, these different overlaps and what design, product, and engineering cares about, sometimes this can actually create a tension between the groups because everyone feels particular ownership to certain product directions and what we're trying to gauge for. So with that, you know, I think it's okay to totally embrace that tension. It's actually a healthy and normal part of your job as a product designer or as a product manager. And it's actually going to make the product better if you have this tension and you kind of argue and think about these different scenarios, because then you're kind of balancing out that trifecta that we're talking about. So with that, I'm going to hand it off to Kevin to talk more specifically about how to work with PMs.
Thanks, Christine. I really appreciated whoever put American bathrooms as an example of a not quality product. But yeah, so I'm going to be talking a little bit about, you know, how do we work with PMs and, you know, how do we work with these folks. So I've been thinking a lot about this, and really what it comes down to is, like any other working relationship, it is a relationship between you and your product partner. I think it has a special emphasis because of the reasons that Christine just went through about how they are your most consequential or design partner when thinking about the product. So I think, all those basic things like trust, communication, all those are really critical, and just learning how you work with your product partners. A lot of things I tend to think about is learning your working styles. A lot of, some of the PMs I work with, it really comes down to what's called complementarities. Like, how do you complement your product partner, and how do they complement you? Like, are they a big vision product or a thinker that like really doesn't have like a care for the details, or and vice versa? Are you that way where you like really like to do a lot of vision work, but then when you start getting down to like the details, like, you actually rely on your partner for that? So learn that working style. Like, are they kind of more methodical or go with the flow? I think is really important. And I think it's also just good to, be upfront with your product partner when you're starting that relationship and just tell them right away. I think that's something that I've learned is really helpful. It's like, how do you like to work with your product partner? And once you kind of establish that, again, coming back to communication up front, I think it just makes the relationship kick off in a smooth way. So different ways you can collaborate, and different tips and tricks that I found useful when collaborating with products are a couple different tools of the trade. So for product partners, on the design, we have Figma, we have prototype, like, or Sketch, or different prototyping things. The tools of the trade for product partners are very much documents and spreadsheets a lot of times. So a lot of what they do is they have this thing called product requirements doc. Has anyone heard of like what a PRD is? Great. And are those the PMs that said that? But so a lot of different kind of docs you'll see are, product requirements doc, where you'll have a doc that like is a really great like kind of communication point for engineering, design, and product to come together to really establish, what is this thing we're building? What does it look like? How are we phasing it? And I think that always starts as like a really good place for those three to come together and really collaborate. And this is a good time to like maybe push things out of MVP, push things in MVP. It's also a good time to, like look at the engineering feasibility of things. There are times where, me and my product partner are like, oh, that's going to be too complicated. And then engineering will, like in this doc, will be like, actually, that's really not that bad. We can probably move that in. So I always find that this is a really good place for all these functions to come together and collaborate. And then even a little bit earlier into not necessarily the requirements phase, strategy docs are also like a really great place for you and your product partner to really think at a high level. A lot of like one pagers can sometimes be strategy docs where it's really just outlining, the user problems you're trying to solve, but also, the business impact. And that's a really great place I find when I'm working with my product partner to really try to either challenge or, work together to collaborate on whether this is, the direction we're going towards and like why that is. I think really clearly stating that is a great place. And on the design side for collaboration tools, how you can collaborate better with your product partner are, depending on what kind of tools you use. Like Figma, I find is really useful because of it has this cloud-based collaboration. It's kind of like Google Docs for design. And I found that that's super useful to be able to have product partners look at your designs early on. I think a lot of times when you had like designs that were only local on your computer, kind of like became this like place where you could just like hide your designs and product partners would never see it until like it's finished. But you can see those designs early on and share early with your product partners, and they can get in there and comment. So I find that super useful. And then if you don't really have, Figma, if you're using Sketch, another tip we used to do is called rolling docs, where you would just create a doc and you can kind of upload, various iterations of it. So again, having collaboration between you and your product partners that can go in there and comment. And just prototypes, sometimes like, especially when you're getting really complex in your designs, you have these, really complex, like long flows you have to go through and different variations. It's so much more useful to like, and helpful for product partners to be able to just click through prototypes and kind of understand that rather than try to lay out all these flows. So all these ways you can share these designs early with your product partner I found is really helpful for them and you to collaborate more. And then just some things that are not tool related is just meetings and the different kinds of meetings you'd have. Like I always have weekly one-on-ones with my product partner that we can sometimes purpose for jam time, or sometimes it's just aligning on some of the more logistical details of like where we're at in the process and timelines. And then always invite them to major design reviews. We have a lot of design reviews at LinkedIn, and you always want your product partners to be there. Not to just be in the loop, but they can also help answer questions that sometimes can be more business related or sometimes be more technical. So I always find that's helpful to always go in with your product partner in all these reviews. And then, so my question for everyone here is: do you have any collaboration tips that have worked well when working with your product partners? Yeah, mirror boards, being empathetic. It's great. Yeah, I've definitely, in the world of the pandemic, we don't really have whiteboards in offices anymore. So I found, tools like Miro to be super useful especially when you're in those early stages and you're just trying to jam together with your product partner. Yeah, sharing meeting notes. Yeah, that's a good one. It's an underrated one. Yeah, these are great. Yeah, giving everyone a chance to speak. Yeah, that's actually one of the things that one of my PMs is actually really good at when we were early in a stage of a project, and it's me, engineering, me, marketing. We're all there together thinking through it. Like my PM will be like, okay, I want to hear everybody's perspective, and we'll go around the room and ask like, what's your perspective on this? What's your perspective on this? That's a great one. All right, so the next thing I wanted to talk about is dealing with conflict. So you're going to have disagreements with your product partner. It's unavoidable. Like I've never 100% agreed with a product partner on everything we do. But it's important to find ways that you can work through those disagreements. So one of the things that I found that's really critical, I think, for design, but also product to focus on is framing and making a persuasive case. If you believe that we should be, making the design this way or building this feature, or the strategy should be focused on this, really focus on how you build that case and tell that story. Like, do you have data or research to back that up, and really clearly articulate that, why you think this is a problem when you solve, why your solution is the right way to do it. I think that is one of those things that everybody knows, but like time and time again, this isn't really about resolving conflict, but a lot of it's about avoiding conflict. Because if you at least can see where each other's coming from and understand that thinking, a lot of I think a lot of miscommunication can happen so easily, especially when everybody's like in 1,000 meetings every day and you only have so much time. That really articulating that up front is really great in terms of at least understanding where everyone's coming from and why they feel that. And PMs need to do that too. And I think you'll see that a lot from PMs and strategy docs and one pagers where they'll articulate like, this is the user problem we're solving, this is our solution, this is why we think this is the solution and how it works, this is the business impact. So I get ready to read a lot of docs, but I think that's actually the most useful, is to really understand where PM's is at. So we have a couple ways to work through disagreements. One, I think it's just okay to say no. I think this is also from like a bandwidth perspective too. A lot of times, I find that like engineering resources are like meticulously calculated. So it's like, well, we need 6 engineers, we only have 4, so we can't do it. Whereas design, it could be a little bit more flexible. We can kind of be stretched a little bit. So I think it's really good to make sure to know what your bandwidth is and your limitations, and don't stretch yourself too thin. If like you can't take something out, it's okay to say no. And also if you have, disagreements over the direction of it, again, frame why you think that's the case. Another thing is to also just ask the team. I've been talking to there's been times where me and PM like literally disagreed on like the size of a button, like we couldn't get past it. So we just brought in the team, and sometimes that's useful because the team like unanimously goes in one direction. It can kind of quell that disagreement. You can move past it together. You can also bring out outside experts like user research. data science, like they, sometimes can act as like neutral parties to, help you guys get past that. And the last thing we have at LinkedIn is called escalations. So escalations is when you have two people that can't, or two teams that can't disagree. To be honest, it's usually between two product managers on different teams, but what that does is essentially you write down your points of view and your perspectives, and then you bring that to leadership, and then leadership makes a call, and then that's the final decision. I don't find that design and product usually escalate against each other, because generally every like designer and product manager can work past their disagreements and agree to disagree. But the one time I did see a product manager and a designer escalate against each other was actually my old product partner that I was working with. Christine escalated against this product partner because a lot of it was miscommunication, but essentially this product partner I was working with was saying, hey, we're going to implement this design, this feature over here. And I said, does Christine's team know about it? And he was like, yeah, no, they know, they're on board with it. And I was like, okay, I trusted my product partner. I should trust my product partner. So we went ahead and implemented this design, and then Christine was visiting the New York office at this time, and this is my first time meeting her. And she was like, oh, hey, by the way, what's this on my feature right now? And I was like, oh, you don't know about this? We thought you knew. And she's like, no, I've never seen that. This actually kind of breaks some of our patterns. So eventually I didn't realize that, Christine's team was not even on board with that. And my product partner like kind of didn't tell me about that. So eventually, it went to an escalation between my product partner and Christine. And that was actually probably the only time I've seen product design escalate. But it was good. It was a really good learning there, that it's like design has paths to, escalate against product, when there is that disagreement. And I love that story because that's actually how Christine and I met, and, we're buddies now. And after that, I'll hand it over to Christine to talk about being a good design partner.
Yeah, no more escalations since then, right, Kevin?
Yeah,
but who's to say that might be ever the last? Anyway, so yeah, thanks for walking that through. I think those are some really great like overall tips in terms of how designers can work better with their PMs. I wanted to focus on some tips for designers to think about in terms of being a good partner with your product manager. As a designer, you have equal say in terms of how the success of your project goes as well. So one of the things that I think is really important for designers when we're kind of kicking off the design phase is really facilitating the conversations around the design. I see a lot of the time during the design phase, scope creep can happen quite frequently, where people are like, oh, let's do this, and then let's also do this. And then you have like tons of different opinions from like different stakeholders. And then it actually becomes really hard for you as the designer to figure out what to focus on. And you end up creating a lot of churn for yourself. So one of the things that I always recommend for designers is that it's really important when you're facilitating, whether it's a design sprint, design review, or just a general meeting, that you set the goals for the session to be very clear. So start off with an agenda, start off with like, what's the most important thing that you want to walk away with? And if, to set the tone of that conversation. The second thing is you're always going to get a ton of feedback as a designer. So what's really important is to try to achieve alignment. Now, notice I don't say consensus, because that's a little different. You don't need everybody in the room to agree with you 100%, but people need to be aware of directionally where you're headed and try to get a good understanding of what the vision is going to be. So when you're doing, again, these brainstorms, workshops, design sprints, or reviews, it's really important to articulate the context of why you're doing it and the goals and like, what is your time frame and everything so people can understand. The last thing is, in a lot of design reviews, I see designers just present their work and then just ask for general feedback and just kind of be like, okay, what do you think? The problem with that is that you're going to create a lot of churn for yourself, because people are going to give you feedback at all different stages, whether or not you've thought about those problems yet. So I think what's really important as a designer is to be very intentional when you're presenting your designs and strive for decisions to be made as part of the process. So for example, if you have a key IA decision that is going to impact how you design the rest of the visual designs or the flows, focus on that first when you're doing their design review, and ask for people. It's like, okay, between option A and B, between the information architecture, which one do you prefer? And you can state your your preference and why, and just kind of open up the conversation on that versus leaving it too open-ended. The other thing that I want to convey too is when you're working as a designer with a PM, one of the things is that it's actually really important to make suggestions to the product too. Don't just accept the strategy doc or the product requirements document as gospel. PMs are human too. They don't always get all their information correct or like know everything that's going on around. So if there's something that just kind of feels off to you in terms of the strategy, or you're not clear as to why you guys are doing this, or if this is the right segment even that you're targeting, I think it's important for you as a designer to raise that, because you're closely working with the users. You're sitting in a lot of research. You're really going through that qualitative data, and PMs rely on you to help them kind of keep them in check in line. The second thing is that it's important to be communicative and proactive. I think a lot of the time designers tend to like to go off and kind of work on their own, and sometimes not show progress until they're all the way at the end. But that can actually be bad for you if there's like, unforeseen things that happen, or you spend too much time into something. But if the PM or somebody else on your team had insight to it, it could have saved you a lot of pain. It's important to share your work frequently. And that also means if you're being blocked. So if you don't know something, instead of trying to solve it yourself, it's helpful to rely on your product partners and other folks around to help you unblock. Which kind of leads to my last point. Raise issues and ask for help. So if there's a decision that you're trying to make in your designs is unclear because either you don't have the data, or you're not really clear as the goal again, I think it's really important to raise it and really try to push to get that information so that you can deliver the best designs possible for yourself. Which kind of leads me to like the final slide here, and we will open it up for Q&A after this. But between Jay, myself, and Kevin, we came up with this list of like just some learnings that we've had from our career in terms of working with designers and PMs. And I'll just kind of give like quick examples of some of these. So I think for designers, what is really important, and I saw somebody ask a question about this in the chat earlier, is how do we think about delivering designs, especially when it impacts engineering timelines, and how we get that through? Well, the reality of things is that, we always have a tendency to want to build the perfect picture, and we should. Right, as designers, we want to create the best experiences possible. Where our product partners and engineering usually thinks about things is things more iteratively. So we kind of have to meet them somewhere in the middle. And what I recommend to designers a lot in these types of situations is that you should at least be thinking ahead of what the perfect picture is and structural decisions that you're going to be making to try to mitigate some of these things. But ultimately, at the end of the day, you also need to meet them at where they're at too, and try to deliver things in an iterative process so that you're not completely blocking the team. So it's a little bit of a balance in terms of like figuring that out. The second thing is that reviews are not always about getting consensus. I kind of mentioned this earlier, but sometimes I see junior designers like trying to get every single person in the room to agree with them. To be honest, that's never going to happen. Everyone's going to have a different opinion. And then the next time you show it to the same group, they might have a completely different opinion. So what's really important is to pick and choose selective feedback that is going to help you move forward, and then making sure that you have at least rationale for why you're not addressing the other feedback, instead of trying to make everybody happy. The third thing is don't assume that all PMs operate the same way. So I've worked with some PMs who are extremely hands-on, who are always going to be there for you, who are super organized and like really on top of things. And then I've worked with some PMs who don't like to write product requirements documents at all, like don't show up to your meetings, different types of things. I think this kind of goes back to the beginning points that Kevin had, where it's really important to level set how you guys like to work as a team between product and design. And you have to kind of be a chameleon in certain situations to adapt your process to work with these different partners so that you guys can both be successful. But then at the end of the day, if your product partner isn't helpful to you or really blocking, you also do need to raise that too. It's not like you're throwing them under the bus, but it's just kind of trying to address the fact that you need a little bit more help here. And that might require you talking to their manager or somebody else who might be able to help you. And then the last thing is that in design school and a lot of design programs out there, we do learn the value of research and understanding like qualitative metrics, but we really don't learn enough about quantitative metrics. And for product managers and people in business positions, they really care about that. So what's really important for as a designer is to not shy away from understanding business impacts. In fact, you should always like ask, like, when you start a project, what are the business metrics that you're trying to move? Like, what are the impacts that it's going to create? Why does this matter? How does that tie into the users? And that's going to really help you shape the goals of your design so that you're achieving both the needs of the users and the business. And then for the PM's side, I think one of the pain points for us as designers is that sometimes PRDs can be too prescriptive. I've seen PRDs that literally describe the entire design solution. They should not be that. Designers want creative liberty too, and when it comes to thinking about the problem. So it should be defined enough so that directionally we know where we need to go. It shouldn't give us all the answers. The other thing is designers are not a solve all for product problems. So what I mean by that is that as designers, we can definitely go out and do research and think about strategy, but we're not going to be the ones that will ultimately make the call for like business product market fit or like defining all the metrics and stuff like that. So it still helps for somebody on the business side to take ownership and really lead that. But designers can definitely have an input. We shouldn't be relied on to figure out all those things. And then what's also important for product managers, because sometimes they're very focused on delivering a specific feature, sometimes they forget to look at things holistically. So I think this is where it's important as a designer, because we're thinking about the end-to-end flows to really help remind our product partners that they should be thinking about things from an end-to-end experience versus just focusing like on a single button in a checkout page. And if that's really solving the problem versus looking at the entire checkout flow, for example. And then the last thing is it kind of reflects back to data, but qualitative data is just as important as quantitative data, primarily because it paints the picture behind the why. So you can look at quantitative metrics all you want, but it's really hard to understand why the behaviors are happening in that way. So it still helps to do user research to kind of back that up. And you can't always rely 100% on quantitative data, but again, I think it helps to have the balance of both. So with that, hopefully you guys enjoyed the presentation. We have about 15 minutes, so we wanted to spend some ample time answering your questions. So I'll hand it back to Grace.
Yeah, thank you so much for the great presentation. Feel free to drop any questions, and if any of the hosts see a question in the chat, I know people have been posting questions throughout. There's one you really want to answer, feel free to just hop right in. I know there's something from Vicky, and another +1 from that. Vicky asks, what do you do when you get pushback from the development team, which delays the deployment? I'll post again in the chat. Oops, I copy and pasted the wrong thing. It won't let me copy and paste on Zoom. That's so weird. But basically,
Yeah,
Vicky, there you go.
No worries. I was gonna just ask a clarifying, is it more for a product perspective, design perspective, or I guess both?
I guess both, or Vicky, feel free to follow up as well.
Yeah, so I could start, I guess. So from a design perspective, so if I'm trying to push for a feature and engineering's like, no, this is gonna take us a lot more time. Well, sometimes I dig into the why. Like, what is it that's creating more time? Is it the way that I've created the design solution that's complicating the component? And they're thinking about it in a singular way? Or is there something that I can do to kind of help them like shift their thinking to make it easier? So for example, like just this morning, I was having a discussion with a UI engineer about the padding for like these links on a table. The way that he had created something, it had like extra spacing so not everything was visually aligned. But when I dug into it, I was asking him, well, how come this is? It turns out he put it as a button component, which naturally adds padding around it versus addressing it as a link, which a link could have just solved the same thing because it takes you to a different page, but doesn't add that extra padding. So sometimes just digging into it might be one of the things where like just clarifying with your engineering partner and figuring that out might actually make the solution easier for them without having to go through that. The other thing that you can think about too is just, okay, if they can't commit to it no matter what, because of resources or some sort of like other commitment, then what can they commit to doing the next time? right? So with a lot of features, yes, we're very focused on the MVP, but you have to make iterations too. And then what if we get user feedback that isn't positive? What's the commitment for the team to readdress that? And making sure that that's prioritized at some point on the project roadmap is another way of thinking about it.
Awesome, thank you. Always asking why to really empathize and try to understand people is really important. I want to bring up a question Jacqueline asked earlier in the chat. I'll copy and paste it again. So Jacqueline asks, what are your suggestions to work with PMs that don't write out detailed product requirements?
Oh, that's a good one. Let's see. Well, what you don't want to do is get into the habit of writing them yourselves, which sometimes you do have to do. Like I've had to do that, but like that's not really like, yeah, it's not really like our jobs. But I have been in those situations where I had a PM that just like refused to write that out. But I feel like sometimes in those cases, well, one, you should try to figure out why they won't write it, and dig into that a little bit more. And honestly, I've had to give feedback to like a PM's like manager being like, look, I'm confused, engineering's confused, like we need this person to write out a product spec. But there's been other times where I've buddied up with engineers and just worked with them too, and then we've like figured that out. Like sometimes I've seen like engineering docs act as like an informal kind of PRD for that. So those have been some of the kind of stopgaps I've worked around. But you know, it also depends on, you know, the level of complexity for the feature too. Sometimes like if it's really simple, you don't need a PRD for everything, but sometimes if it's like a really, really complex feature, like there's a point where it's like, okay, we actually really do need to document this out. Otherwise, like I said, you know, try to buddy up with engineering, find ways where you can use like either like the end, what we call RFCs, which is like the engineering kind of document that like explains the technicals of it. Or, you know, you can kind of create your own, you know, design, like little Figma website that kind of acts like that too. And sometimes the engineers just need to like see how things work. And they might not necessarily need everything. Jay, do you have any thoughts on that too?
Yeah, and I just want to quickly add, Kevin, like another way that I've done it too, where there's an opportunity for design to really step in is either a design sprint. So just kind of leading with that with some sort of brainstorming exercise and then defining a set of requirements based on some like the needs that you hear from the design sprint, or using foundational user research. So sometimes that could be a way to uncover like the user needs, and like taking the synthesis work and prioritizing that into a set of features can also be like an impromptu way of starting off with a PRD without a PRD.
Wow, sounds like product doesn't need to do a whole lot if we just have great designers leading the way.
We still need you, Jay.
Honestly,
we definitely need a PRD.
I mean, I think whether it's a PRD doc or it's a brainstorm exercise, at the end of the day, it's a communication failure. So learning how to bring that from your partner, whether it's, you know, too little or too many details, is something that you do have to manage through these tactics that Christine and Kevin mentioned. But, you know, in terms of like PMs, I think there's a base minimum bar that you need to meet in order to consider that you're giving specs for someone to be able to action on. And that's really a bar that you should be holding your partners up to. And beyond that, it's a careful marriage around you working together to, you know, find a solution that works for not just you two, but the engineering team in terms of feasibility. Can I tackle a question I saw above? And I think it hits home for me.
Yeah.
And one of the questions was with regards to like scope creep. I think the most recent one was from Lucy. What if you're suffering from feature creep and the PM is CEO or CTO? Any tips for narrowing the scope? I've worked at a startup, completely familiar with that. And you know, I've had really bad ways of dealing with that, which is, you know, getting to the point of a shouting match, to really strategic ways of saying this is the actual bandwidth that we have, you know, and I can completely relate to that experience. I think the knowing really well how to empathize where they're coming from. If they're at a startup and it's your CEO or CTO that's a product manager, they probably have never been a product manager in a structured large org. And they're probably faced with trying to get that, you know, product market fit. They're trying to get that, you know, the hockey stick shaped trajectory of adoption and growth. And under that, they are rapidly pivoting on a regular basis to address the needs of one or two critical customers that say that they will sign on if you do X, Y, and Z. So in that situation, you have only a couple of things of recourse. One, educating them on what the team can deliver by working with EPM to display, this is what our current trajectory and bandwidth has been. Show them history of what the team has been able to do and focus on. And then give them optionality instead of just saying no. The last thing that someone that is in that position wants to hear is, I can't do that, because they'll talk to somebody else that maybe will step on the, sure, we'll try to fit it in. So number one is giving them choices. Number two is making sure the rest of the team has cohesion around how you position those choices and optionality and what the value is you're trying to drive. And understanding really truly what the priorities are and fixing timelines to that. And that might be a 1 week sprint rather than a 2 week sprint. But putting yourself on a level playing field to, trade in a currency that everybody understands, it's well grounded, is something that helps you along the way, up until you get to the point where maybe your team is able to, anticipate the next pivot that your CTO or CEO might have for you.
Yeah, thanks for sharing. I can relate to that with design buddies. We get a lot of requests and stuff, and I had to make sure it aligns to our roadmap, things like that. But yeah, getting back to the questions. So our next question comes from Angela. As a new designer joining a company, since most of the people in design buddies are relatively new in their career, what kind of questions do you suggest asking your PM to get to know them better? Paste it again in the chat.
Yeah, for me personally, I like to break the ice with just personal information, because sometimes if you kind of know somebody on a friendly level, it's actually easier for you to deliver harder feedback later down the line, because you don't feel like, they're there's that barrier. So anything that you are comfortable sharing about your personal life and maybe some of your hobbies and things like that would be a good way to kind of just break that ice. The other thing that I think is really important is just to understand their working style, particularly around communication. So not everybody loves Slack, not everybody loves email. Some people prefer phone calls even, or text. So figuring out what's the best way to get a hold of that person, and then also how frequently they want to communicate. There's some people who love having meetings, and that's the only way you're ever going to get them to look at any of your designs. But some are totally fine with doing it asynchronously via email or Slack. So I think that's really important. The other thing is also just figuring out what is that communication style? How do you, are they very direct? Do they prefer that? Or, is it do they like getting consensus with other folks before kind of getting to the next stage? Things like that is also really important to say. And I think those are probably some of the big things for me. Kevin, is there anything that you've learned from your career?
Yeah, no, I'd say similarly, trying to connect with them on a more personal level. I think one of the things that me and my PM currently do is we set up this kind of, I think it's once a month meeting where we bring in all design and PM together. And it's very informal in terms of we can kind of share across teams about what we're working on to, facilitate communication. But we also spend maybe 15 minutes just doing icebreakers and, just personal stuff. I remember, last year at the end of the year, we did, how Spotify sends the what you listen to most. We went around the room and shared with each other. It's what have you listened to the most this year? So I think actually a lot of things that aren't necessarily just work related really, help you learn about the people that you're working with, and then, build that, again, it's everything's a relationship. So really building that so you can get past, disagreements, as you're working with each other.
Cool. Thank you all so much for sharing. There's a lot of great questions in the chat, but we have about 3 more minutes left. 3 more minutes left before we take our group photo. If there's anything you guys see in the chat, feel free to answer it. And I'm trying to pick the question. So our next question comes from Jason. Jason asks, as someone who's currently to be a UX designer, I'm also interested in the PM role. So for designers thinking whether they want to go to designer or PM, and what would you suggest as someone who's in his position to make a more informed decision, picking career paths, design versus PM?
Yeah, I think I could just quickly answer this because I was in a crossroads of this early on in my career too. So it ultimately came down at the end of the day, what's going to make me more happy and what am I good at? So within PM, for me, I came from a business background, and I knew how to do all of that stuff in terms of figuring out different analyses and working with data and coming up with strategies. But when I kind of dug into it a little bit more, there was just a lot of other folks that you're working with within product that I personally just didn't have an interest working with very closely. And then the other thing is that for me, it was like I really just enjoyed the creative aspect of design a lot more. Like I really like being really close to the users more so than figuring out like deep engineering problems, for example. And I like focusing on like visuals and thinking about things creative aspects creatively. So that's kind of why I leaned more towards design ultimately at the end of the day. Now, where it's kind of been interesting for my career is where I started to intersect back both between design and product is in design management. Because now I don't really do any outputs as a designer. I'm not working very closely in Figma, but I'm working very closely with the strategy all the time. So I feel like that's where I've kind of found my sweet spot in my career. So hopefully that kind of helps you, Jason. I don't know, Jay, is there anything from your perspective? Because I know your wife's a designer, so maybe you have like some thoughts there.
So yeah, it's a good question. I think the way you started framing it is something that I take it to heart. I've done 3 career pivots in my life, and I haven't regretted anything because I optimized for learning a new skill. It wasn't about the role or the title per se, but what do I actually really enjoy doing that I want to get better at, or something that I don't know that I wanted to learn. So with that kind of growth mindset, it makes it always interesting for what you might pursue. And I think, if anything, LinkedIn, promotes a culture of next play. How do I figure out what I want to do with my life that fulfills me, that sustains me? And it's something that I would actually definitely encourage you, whether it's just trying out a PM role, temporarily supporting a lead because you're under-resourced. Play that role, try it out. I'm not going to invoke my learnings from my wife, only because 2 things. 1, I am not a designer, but 2, I know how to talk to a designer, and that's really important. And I think if you're able to speak the language of a product manager, if you're able to speak the language of a designer, you will be better at shipping products. You'll be more influential. And as you hit across the crossroads where, you figure out these are areas that I maybe want to double down on, that's an opportunity to pursue that new role. But, certainly encourage you to experiment as much as possible to figure out what you want to do long term.
Awesome. Thank you all so much. We're going to do a group photo now. So feel free to turn your camera. If you have Design Buddies Zoom background, feel free to wear it as well. And you're welcome to grab any fun object, like a plushie. I'm going to first do a group photo, a static one, and later a wave for our Instagram story. So, and also feel free to connect with any of our hosts on LinkedIn for any follow-up questions, and also connect with Design Buddies as well. And we also have a networking sheet where you can connect with each other, especially networking super important early on in your career, ask each other questions and everything too. But yeah, we're going to hop into our group photo soon. But yeah, maybe you could stop sharing your screen so we could do the group photo really quick.
Okay, there you go, Grace.
Awesome, thank you. All right, I'm going to count down a few seconds and y'all can turn on your camera. I'm going to do a group photo and then later our Instagram wave for the host 5-minute retrospectives after this. But yeah, feel free to bring plushie. I always bring this bear with me as well. It's a very nice bear, Rilakkuma bear. But yeah, all right, I'm gonna count down 5 seconds. I'll take a group photo and then hold your smile a few seconds until I say we're done, because I have multiple pages. And after that, we're gonna do a little we can wave for our Instagram story. All right, so 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Say cheese. Cool. I'm going to do multiple pages, so stay smiling. All right, we're going to do a little wave for Instagram story, and then this concludes our event. Thank you all so much for coming. Make sure to, feel free to wave first. For Instagram story at design.buddies. Hello, buddies. We are working together as designers and PMs with Christine, Jay, and Kevin. Thank you, everybody, for coming. Cool. Thank you all so much. That concludes our event. Make sure to follow all of us connect with all of us on LinkedIn, connect with each other on the networking sheet, and connect with everybody. And thank you all so much for coming. See you at the next event. We have a fun social event on Friday. Going to be on announcements tonight, dropping on Discord, so make sure you stay for that. with that, I'll stop streaming on YouTube and have a nice day, everyone.